Hi, everybody. This is Stefani Rupert. Thank you for tuning in to the Meaning of Everything podcast, where we ask some of our deepest questions about who we are and what we can do about it. Today is episode number 28, and I'm having on Amod Lele, a specialist in Indian philosophy who also specializes in how we can apply philosophical concepts to our daily lives. Now, this whole podcast exists because somebody who listens to this podcast recommended Amod to me. This listener sent me a link to Amod's blog, and I stumbled on it and realized that Amod was writing about things that I have put a lot of thought into, but he was saying things that I hadn't yet thought of, that I hadn't yet researched, and it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And so I reached out immediately. I was like, hey, I got to have you on. And specifically, Amod has a lot of really cool ideas on his blog, loveofallwisdom.com. Amod has a lot of really cool ideas. But one of the topics that is most fascinating to me and pressing is something that he calls qualitative individualism. Now, you might be thinking, what the heck is that? When I first encountered the idea, I also thought, what the heck is that? This is the phrase that Amod uses, and Amod has a blog post actually explaining why he chose these words. Qualitative individualism gestures towards this idea we have that you need to just be yourself, and that happiness comes from finding your true self or building your true self, or whatever kind of language. Usually it's finding, listening to yourself, being who you are. And this idea, which is so live in our culture today, has really long and interesting historical roots, which Amod and I discuss in the podcast, and really interesting implications for how we try to make careers today, and how we try to be spiritual, and how we try to find happiness, and also with how we identify. And Amod and I actually have a really fascinating conversation about cultural appropriation and about identity politics, and all of the ways in which this kind of individualism is really shaping our political discourse. And it's all very important, and both on the right and the left, we need to be, I think, taking a much closer look at this idea, specifically with respect to things like identity politics, which are so important today. So I'm very eager to get into the conversation. Just a little bit more about Amod. I'll tell you a bit about his background. Amod has a PhD in Indian philosophy, I believe, from Harvard, and is currently working, which we discuss in the podcast later, is currently working at Boston University, not as a full-time professor, not as faculty, but does teach an occasional course. And so Amod is working full-time and an academic on the side, and a great academic on the side. And that's a really great and important thing for us to be talking about, is the way in which academia is how we wrap up our identities with academia and sort of draw these strict lines between what's in academia and what isn't. And I think that those are lines that really need to be blurred, which is, of course, why in part I do this podcast, and also why Amod's work is so important, because Amod is a brilliant philosopher and teaches a great course on philosophy, and has done a lot of work and research, and is still working, earning a living somewhere else. So that's all very important stuff that we dive into. And I want to dive into it right now. So thank you again very much for tuning in. I am so happy to have you here with us. Without further ado, welcome, Amod. Welcome, Amod. Hi.
Hi, Stephanie.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. It's, I have mono.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, of course you didn't. I have mono, and it is tiring. It's very tiring.
You look fantastic, considering. That's
I appreciate that. That is the wonder of 21st century makeup right there.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. So anyway, that's been my life recently, and trying to get work done at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're in Boston, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And how is that? Did you just get a huge snowstorm? I hate talking about the weather, but I'm actually really curious.
Yeah, it was moderately large yesterday morning. Yeah, not so large that we got the day off from work, which we were
Right.
sort of expecting, but then didn't happen.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. And so you've been in Boston for a while, right? Working on questions about Eastern philosophy, Indian philosophy?
Yeah, well, I came to the Boston area in 2000 to do a PhD at Harvard, and the field was officially the study of religion because I wanted to work on Asian philosophy, and it still is difficult to work on Asian philosophy in philosophy departments. I think the situation's
Mhm.
got significantly better over the past 10 years, but it's still be hard. And in 2000, there were very few philosophy departments where you could study Asian philosophy, and so religion departments often seemed like a better fit. So that's where I did my degree, and I finished that up in 2007. Tried to go on the academic job market for a few years, and that didn't really work out for reasons that anyone in academia is familiar with. But I had, in my last year of grad school, I had met the woman who would become my wife, and she has a lot of ties to the Boston area. So I decided to stay here, and it has a lot of advantages. I was able to pivot to this day job in educational technology, which is going quite well. I'm a manager now, and it also means there's such a large intellectual community around the Boston area, which I really appreciate. There's a reading group that meets every Tuesday at Harvard to talk about Hegel and Heidegger,
Wow.
and that's and most of the people involved are not at Harvard. It's just people from around various universities in the area, and
Hmm.
there aren't that many places in the world that sort of thing happens.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I actually am a firm believer in the endeavor, right? And the quality of thinking and work that can be produced once if you have stepped outside of academia, right? Your blog is brilliant, right? And it's really
Thank
well
you.
researched. You're welcome. And it's really well researched and all of these different things. And you just happen to have this life where you are a scholar and also employed at the same time. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I think it's really important that we understand that we shouldn't put such rigid boundaries between academic and not academic, you know?
Right, and well, that's certainly my life. I mean, I do teach a course in Indian philosophy at BU on the side. It's not part of my day job payment, so it's a significant extra work, but it is something that I enjoy doing, and so I'm effectively an adjunct for the purposes of that course, which is generally a terrible thing that I advise people not to do. But basically, this is the right way to be an adjunct is to have a full-time job that has nothing to do with your adjuncting that actually pays your rent, and then being an adjunct gets you some extra money as well as doing something you like, and that's a great way to do it. So I'm able to do that, and able to publish scholarly articles as well. Working on some right now and have some ideas for a book. It's a busy life, but I enjoy it, and I will say it helps a lot that I don't have children. I don't think I could combine the paid employment and my scholarly passions in the way that I do if raising new human beings was also a part of the picture.
Yeah, they take a lot of time. I feel the same way about children and about boyfriends. So
Yeah.
I work. Cool. That's really cool. Thank you for sharing about your life. I wanted to talk about Amod knows this, but listeners, I wanted to talk about a particular set of ideas that I found really interesting on Amod's blog. There are actually many interesting ideas on the blog. Can you remind me what it's called again, the blog?
The blog's called Love of All Wisdom.
Yes, and I will link to it in the show notes. It's great. Google it, click on it if you're into philosophical ideas and especially how they can be applied or thought about in your daily life. It's a really great resource. So I recommend that. One of the ideas that you've been thinking about recently is something that's really important to me, which is sort of the way that we practice individualism or romanticize individualism in the West. I guess
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's a way to put it. You use the language of qualitative individualism, which
Yeah.
is such a philosophical term. Like it's such a, a scholarly way.
Yeah.
Qualitative individualism. Can you tell us like what that looks like in our daily lives?
Yeah, I mean, it's the term qualitative individualism is the best one that I found so far. I'm not entirely crazy about it, in part just because it is such a mouthful, but it's the one that so far I've found expresses the idea best, and it comes from a sociologist philosopher named Georg Simmel, kind of turn of the 20th century author. And what Simmel meant when he came up with the idea was that when we use the term individualism, there are two different kinds of things that we might mean. That people kind of often think about individualism in terms of this sort of ideal of political equality that comes from people like Locke and Kant, who think that like everybody should have this kind of formal equality, and they all are owed respect for their dignity as individuals, that all have equal worth that comes from their kind of capacity as human reasoners. And the thing about that approach is that the differences between human beings don't matter a whole lot. It's the sort of the fact that you are human and have this sort of rational humanity and sort of human dignity, which is the same as everybody else's human dignity, is what's really kind of decisive in that ethics, and especially that political philosophy. And Simmel wants to distinguish that from qualitative individualism, which is one where the differences are actually paramount. And I think that when Kant talks about the reasons for being ethical in the way that he wants people to be, he says that he's very, very concerned with the idea of autonomy. He wants everybody to be making decisions for themselves. And yet the way that plays out is that each person's decision-making principle, when they're truly autonomous, is exactly the same as everybody else's decision-making principle. That it all comes down to this categorical imperative, which is to act according to a universalizable moral law. Which kind of feels odd in a lot of ways, to think that your autonomy consists in being the same as everybody else in some really crucial respect. Because for Kant, the things that make you different from other people are your desires and your inclinations. Those are, in some sense, not really you. The core of who you are is this rational ability to follow in a rule-governed way. Whereas for the qualitative individualists, really the important thing is what makes us as what makes me and makes you as in ways that are different from each other, and that's something really kind of decisive, more than following a universalizable law. And I think one of the reasons we haven't talked about the ideal sort of philosophically is I don't think it's had defenders who are kind of as clear about it as Kant is. The people who have advocated it have often been people like Emerson and especially Nietzsche, who there's a lot of other things kind of tied up in there, and I think there is a certain kind of paradox underlying it, which is that to the extent that you really do value this individual difference, it's hard to state it philosophically in the sense that it kind of has to be different for every person. It leads to the kind of things in what is it? It's one of the Monty Python movies. I think it's Holy Grail, where the person's kind of up on the speech, and there's this crowd that's all sort of looking for a leader, and he says, no, you should think for you shouldn't be following me. You should think for yourselves. You should all be individuals, and the crowd all shouts out, yes, we are all individuals. So there is always that little sort of tension and kind of self-undermining there. But I think it's really important to think philosophically about this ideal of qualitative individualism, because I think it underlies so much of our everyday ways of thinking, and the kind of the ethical and practical and even psychological advice that we give to each other every day. I mean, everybody's heard the injunction to be yourself. And what I think is sort of important to notice about that is that the advice isn't just, well, I want to be myself, leave me alone. It's be yourself. It's held up as an ideal for other people to follow. It's not just like, leave me alone and let me do my thing. It's, you should do your thing. And someone one of the commenters on the blogs pointed out how kind of tautological that is. How would it be possible to not be yourself? And yet, it is advice that is frequently given, in part because I think there's a widespread feeling that it's very easy to kind of lose yourself in a sense, or just not have found yourself. Right? We talk about finding myself as a sort of a kind of cliche about what like people going through a midlife crisis will do is go off to India to find yourself or whatever. The idea being that we in a certain way we don't really know who we are. And I mean, Nietzsche subtitles Ecce Homo with how one becomes what one is, and this comes out in so many pop songs. Like I always think of Sting's Englishman in New York, that closing tagline he repeats over and over, saying "Be yourself, no matter what they say." And so and that's kind of the contrast there, right? Is that being yourself is defined against them. And that's something that I guess is sort of in Heidegger to a certain extent. Das Man, usually translated the they, right? Is this sort of like amorphous blob of conformity that to be authentically ourselves we need to sort of react against. So there's some of this developed in existentialism, but in ways that I think are not necessarily the most helpful. There's a lot here, and I've been trying to explore it. And I think I did a series of posts about this on my blog, kind of over the last couple of months, and it's been the longest series of posts that I've ever done. I think it came out to about 8 of them, and there's probably still some more to say. But a big part of the reason for that is I've just been really trying to explore this and work it out, because I believe in the kind of advice that someone like Hans-Georg Gadamer would give, that you have to start philosophical inquiry where you are, with your presuppositions sort of as they are, and figure out kind of what it is that you already believe, and your sort of presuppositions or prejudices, and then kind of move dialectically from there to a more adequate position. And I think for the vast majority of us living in the 21st century West, and even beyond the West at this point, really, this ideal of qualitative individualism is huge. So I mean, Sting, that's 35 years ago now, but it keeps coming up. And something like the movie Frozen, and the Let It Go sequence in there is all about kind of throwing off the expectations that have kept Elsa out of being who she is.
Yeah, I think you're right that there's so much wrapped up in it. There is, I think, something that we could add to your description of why perhaps, or why it's so common, or the advice that we're often given. I think we sort of attach a purpose or a satisfaction to it, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's often the advice because we expect that it's going to be the thing that fulfills us or fulfills people, and if they're not happy, maybe it's because they're not being their true selves. So people are desperately seeking for their true selves, although there is a sense in which we understand that might not be the solution, or the question itself could be part of the problem.
Right.
Which is interesting. What do you think?
Right. Well, I think, I mean, I've noticed, especially in the past couple of years, that this is something I think is essential for the transgender movement. That whenever you hear people talk about being transgender and why that's significant, over and over, there's a message about, well, this is my true self. This is a male body, or when has a male anatomy, or was assigned male, but really I'm female. That's my true self. That's the there's kind of that rhetoric around it, and so and for reasons like that, it becomes very much a political ideal as well as an ethical one. Right? That people feel that there are political and social structures that, even if they do know what their true self is, prevent them from actualizing it.
Yeah, and there's a sense in which the American political landscape is itself, right? And this is, of course, in large part wrapped up in capitalism, but the American political landscape is First Amendment, right? Free speech. These are my thoughts. These are my ideas. And there's something, I think, almost nationalistic about American individualism, right? I have the freedom to be myself, as opposed to anywhere else in the world, right? Where the freedoms aren't as great.
Well, that's, yeah, and there, I think it's, that individualism is, that's where the kind of distinction between the two kinds of individualism becomes
Mm,
important as well, is because I think there is a strong individualism written into the U.S. Culture and constitution, but it's not necessarily about finding oneself in this way, and at least in the way
mm,
that it's come, because it comes out, of a sort of 18th century Lockean conception. And Simmel, when he makes the qualitative versus quantitative distinction, will say that the quantitative individualism is a very 18th century thing, and the qualitative individualism is a very 19th century thing. And the American
interesting.
institutions were set up in the 18th century when Locke and Kant were kind of very much the thinkers who were figuring things out, and then the 19th century kind of went
Mm,
in a different direction. Although I think American thinkers did play a significant role in the development of qualitative individualism. I've been reading about how Emerson was actually an influence on Nietzsche, and I think that's something that people it came as news to me when I read that,
I
and
know. Look at
something I
my
want
face.
to, yeah, yeah. And I
That's
haven't looked
interesting.
into that very much,
Mhm.
but that I think is significant.
Yeah, okay. So obviously this idea goes back really far, and you in your blog you take it back to Plato and Aristotle, and I want to talk about the history, although I know that that could probably take a really long time.
Sure.
So can you tell us a little bit about where it comes from? And I think probably particularly importantly is the relationship that it has developed with capitalism.
Right, right, right. Yeah, there are a lot of different angles to approach that question. I think philosophically, it's tied very much to Romanticism, and there were one of the terms I was kind of looking at before I settled on qualitative individualism was Romanticism, but I realized like Romanticism means this whole other wide range of things, including like relationship to nature and other stuff that isn't really directly connected or a part of this ideal. And I think the German Romantics in particular were the ones who really kind of developed it. Wilhelm von Humboldt and Johann Gottfried Herder, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, Friedrich Schleiermacher. These are all just kind of names I'm throwing out here, but they're kind of the ones who they were all kind of part of a movement that we now sort of look at as Romanticism, and one which was really influential in development of contemporary philosophy, not just in Germany. And they're the ones who really kind of come up with this idea that our individual differences are really philosophically significant, and we need to sort of develop our individual creativity in ways that aren't necessarily what other people do. And so that's happening at a time when Germany is moving towards a capitalist system, not quite industrial capitalism yet, although that's kind of happening in England. They're seeing it there. And I think it's not a coincidence that capitalism is tied to this idea, because I think it's an ideal that doesn't really make a lot of sense in a pre-capitalist society, when your only real social option is to be a farmer just like your father was, be a homemaker just like your mother was, and like their father and mother were, and like their father and mother were, and that the social order is kind of enshrined in being the same way as it was for generations. This idea of finding yourself and becoming who you are doesn't make a lot of sense in that kind of context. You kind of have to, have to subordinate yourself to this sort of social structure. Whereas capitalism, what we often sort of think of capitalism in terms of market exchange and profit making, but those are things that have always existed to some extent or another. When people really sort of say, well, what was decisive in the making of capitalism itself, the most important thing is the free labor market, that people can go from job to job, and there are ways that can be oppressive, in that people may be kicked off their traditional land and have no choice but to be kind of itinerant workers in a way that leaves them poorer than they were. But what it does mean is that there is this ability to move and ability to find something that's best suited to you in your position, given the constraints. And those constraints may still be more decisive than your ability to find yourself, but but it makes this ideal sort of possible and thinkable. And as I say it on the blog post, it also frustrates that ideal at every turn. And thinking about my own life, kind of realizing how I had a passion for cross-cultural philosophy, and I thought yes, I'm going to go and realize that and live that dream and be paid to read and write about big ideas just like my father was. That's what I want to do. And then realizing that in the following 40 or 50 years, the structures of the system had changed to a point that was not a viable path for me. The opportunities that my father had didn't exist for me, largely because of, I think, capitalist modes of reasoning on behalf of the university, where there was a long period in the 90s and 2000s where people were saying, oh, there's going to be a big demand for professors in the coming years because all the baby boomers are retiring, and the people that they hired to teach the baby boomers are retiring, so that's going to create a lot of vacancies. And yeah, well, it depends on how you define vacancies. I mean, the jobs were freed up, but they were replaced with adjuncts being paid $2,000 a course with no benefits instead of they could just hire tons of adjuncts at that rate to fill out the position that once might have been taken by one professor teaching 2 courses a semester for $70,000 a year with benefits. And I think, like, my father's a Marxist, and I had sort of moved away from that for a while during grad school. And, I think in part because I sort of felt immunized from capitalism and market forces, seeing the university as this sort of different world. And then I got this rude awakening that actually it's anything but, and seeing that no, universities are subject to the same pressures as every other part of the market economy, especially because I happened to go on the market in 2007, and I didn't get a job that year because I was sort of just out of my PhD and still, not maybe ready for a position yet. But then, the following year was 2008 and the great crash, and the bottom fell out of the market, and then there were just these positions that vanished, and it all dried up. And I came to realize, well, so because of the kind of pressures of capitalism, like, actually, no, I can't actualize myself, not for a living, in the way that we were told. And I think there's a big, the baby boomers in particular, I think were the ones who really believed most passionately in the qualitative individualist ideal. If you read, like, the Port Huron Statement of the Students for a Democratic Society and those sorts of documents, they are really saying, we believe in work as people's power to be creative and define themselves. And the advice that my generation at least heard over and over was, do what you love and the money will follow. And that, I often say that's a lie. I pull back from saying that that's a lie now, but the only reason I pull back from saying it's a lie is that I don't think it's actually delivered with intent to deceive. But it sure as hell does deceive. It is absolutely false, 100%. And the most mind-blowing and amazing and staggering thing about that statement is that so many people believed it when it's so absurd on the face of it. Why would we ever think that the money would follow from people doing what they love? That's just that's it's like saying eat all the fat and sugar you want, and health will follow. It's the opposite of good advice. But because the boomers lived through the biggest expansion of wealth that the human race has ever seen and maybe ever will see, they could think that was good advice. And so the ideal of qualitative individualism really flowered in the 60s especially. And I think, that the flowering of that ideal, I think, probably was a good thing, but we're still sort of left then to kind of pick up the pieces in a world that economically bears more resemblance to the world of their parents in the 30s than to their world in the 60s and 70s. And we're much more in the world of their parents, who gave the advice of, like, oh, why don't you major in something useful like business? You'll never actually get a job as a folk singer.
Yeah, I do. So something that I learned from reading your blog was that we tend to underappreciate the individualism of Karl Marx.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think when Marx kind of talks about, he doesn't talk very much about what the better future classless society would look like, and I think when he does, it's mostly in his early writings. But what he does there, he will say, well, he will talk about a world where I can hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and be a critical critic in the evening, just as I have a mind, and one where one is actually kind of able to self-define the work that one does. And his when he I mean, he actually has a lot of admiration for capitalism, which I think is also something that's under appreciated in his thought. The passages where he talks about the wonders that the bourgeoisie has accomplished. But I think when he's criticizing capitalism, he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about poverty, even though he suffered through it quite dramatically himself, having his some of his children die for lack of medicine and food. But what's really bothering him about capitalism isn't poverty; it's alienation. The fact that capitalism makes us do work that's not our own, and so that productive work, which he thinks should be the expression of ourselves in the way that qualitative individualism, in the way that the Students for Democratic Society say it should be, that, but it isn't. We have to do work for someone else according to the imperatives of profit making and capital accumulation.
So in this provides a way in which to see alienation as something that can be quite political, right?
Sure. Well, for Marx, of course, it necessarily is. I mean, everything is political in some extent for him. Yeah, that we are in this system ruled by these structures that push us into work that's not really our own. I mean, there's a certain analogy. Catherine McKinnon, the radical feminist, likes to say that sexuality is to feminism what work is to Marxism. And the reason she makes that analogy is saying that, well, it's what is most our own but most taken away. And I think that's sort of the central sort of issue here. And I think it makes for a lot of the ideas that kind of underpin qualitative individualism and the tensions in it of saying, yes, be yourself, but you kind of have to fight to be yourself, and sometimes you may not succeed. The world may not let you be yourself in the way that you hope to be,
and that is very divided along class and racial and all sorts of different identity lines, right?
Right. Well, and then and those questions kind of then throw in their own wrinkle in that there's a question of how we're going to define ourselves, especially in terms of those kinds of group identities. I mean, one of the things that I found about the kind of the politics of the past few years on the left that I found personally a little bit worrying in the kind of approach that sort of standpoint theory politics takes. That sort of kind of tends to divide people into a privileged group and a marginalized group on these various axes of class and race and gender and sexuality and so on, and tends to take those group identities as decisive in a lot of ways, and ways that I find maybe a little unnerving as a brown person who's also a qualitative individualist. I've never wanted to be defined by my race, and I don't like being defined by my race, and I don't think it's decisive of who I am, and I don't want it to be. And it's kind of a weird thing to say from someone who's devoted life to studying Indian philosophy. But the thing is that the Indian philosophy that was really important to me is not the Ganesh-oriented Shaivite Hinduism of my family. It's Buddhism, which for the most part doesn't even exist in India anymore. I discovered Buddhism not in India, but in Thailand. And I have no racial connection to Thailand. I have no family, ethnic, anything connection there. I happened to have a lucky break for a work opportunity there in my early 20s. But, I don't have any communitarian ethnic identity connection to it or any more than a white person would. There's a certain way that I think, people, there are these ideas about, cultural appropriation or staying in your lane that say, well, white people shouldn't write or write about or practice brown topics or brown, Asian philosophies or Asian practices. And I find that frightening, and just to some extent on qualitative individualist grounds, that I think we should be who we are. And I think part of the qualitative individualist ideal is that who we are isn't defined by those community and ethnic categories. It certainly shouldn't be defined by our biology. I think that's a big, again, going back to the transgender movement, right? That in a lot of ways, that's a revolt against biology. It's saying, you see a man and these kind of physical identity of a man, but who I am is a woman. And, so, and similarly, I think, people look at me and see an Indian, which I'm not. I'm an immigrant to the US, but I'm an immigrant from Canada. I've never liked the question of where are you really from, that sort of implies like, oh, where you're really from is where your people are from. But the approach of cultural appropriation and related issues kind of pushes people back into those categories. It says, no, you actually have to stay in your lane. You have to, if you're a white person, you have to do the white thing. If you're a brown person, you have to do the brown thing. And it's staggering to me how much that ideal has taken off in a way that I think really goes against the ideal of self-definition. So for me, I think it is part of the crucial, what's crucial about the ideal is saying like, no, who I am is not these biological categories of race and gender that are sort of predefined. It's something that is kind of my internal teleology based on my mind, my personality, my desires, my cares, my loves, and not on sort of what my body is. Maybe that was a bit of a tangent, I'm not sure.
It was a tangent, but it was a very important tangent, and I'm really glad you went on it. I think these are really important ideas to be discussing, and I find that there's not a lot of flexibility in terms of how these ideas are discussed wherever you are on the political spectrum. If you're on the right or if you're on the left, there are certain things that you're supposed to believe, and and I had a run-in on Facebook today, which is something I try so hard not to do.
Yeah.
Time, and I was like, look, we should be having these we should be having these conversations. I think you make a really good point. I am very interested, in how these two ideas conflict and intersect and can work together, because obviously being a brown person or being a woman or female or what have you, having something as a part of your experience, it's a part of your experience, right? But there's also ways in which you can transcend that experience or carry it with you to a new place or X, Y, and Z things, right? Define yourselves in different ways. And I don't know. I really appreciate that. This has me wondering, okay, so when I wanted to get to this, I want to before we end. So qualitative individualism, I get the feeling from your writing and from this conversation that you have called it an ideal, right? And there is something about it. I think there's something about it that is actually fulfilling, that is nice, or at least in our current society, it functions for us as such. I'm wondering, right, are there drawbacks to this that we should be on the lookout for? I mean, I know that, as you have said, our current system can frustrate our individualism, but are there things that we need to be careful about when we're sort of relating to ourselves?
Yeah, I think there are, and that's something I've been kind of trying to explore in the what I've been thinking through most recently, which is that the big danger of qualitative individualism is that it can be a barrier to growing and getting better. That people can say, oh, this is just who I am, about things that are actually quite self-destructive. I was reading about this book entitled The Highly Sensitive Person, which sort of talks about a category of people who are kind of very, very, very emotional and get upset very easily and get angry easily and react very easily to stimuli. And I think I'm one of those people. And the book, and I haven't read it, so maybe I'm just shooting my mouth off here, but this is kind of my first reaction. The thesis of the book is like, well, this is just a different way of being, and it's totally okay, and we should celebrate that difference. And to that I react, no, it's not okay. We should not celebrate that difference. This stuff has made me miserable for decades. It's been really important for me to learn to control my emotions and learn that people's insults or dismissals of me don't have to hurt me as much as it's natural for them to do. And I don't want to just say, this is me. When people are anorexic and say, oh, my true self is super thin, to the way that a heroin addict is super thin. I think we don't necessarily want to affirm that and say, well, yes, that's who you are and it should be celebrated. And so there's very much this tension. I think it's actually one of the key philosophical difficulties, and I think, again, one of the reasons why the people who've articulated the ideal can be sort of hard to live up to in a certain way. People like Emerson and especially Nietzsche sort of take it to an extreme. And I think there's a balance to be found at some point that we are really particular and different from each other, and it's really important to appreciate that and respect that and develop that. But we are also members of the human species, and there are things that implies. The fact that refined sugar and fat are bad for you is true no matter what your self-definition is. And I think some of the Buddhist points about suffering coming from craving and anger and mental causes are also likely true, whatever your self-definition is. And then there are certain traits of character that will typically help you realize your self-definition, whatever it is. Having tenacity and self-discipline and courage are valuable, whatever it is that you hope to achieve with your life, whether it's something that you're going to get paid for or not. And so, and I think the danger of qualitative individualism is that it moves us away from any sort of focus on virtue like that. The word virtue itself, I think, is probably helpful to think about in this context because, we embrace it in the field of virtue ethics and philosophy, and it's, talking about how important it is to develop our character and become a better person. And yet, in sort of everyday language, I think there's a certain suspicion attached to the idea of virtue, that it's sort of used more ironically than anything else. That it's sort of like it. People think virtue and they think of like 19th century Victorians enforcing an ideal of purity on women. And I think there's a real balance to be struck here. One of the phrasings that I really like, there's a phrase that's kind of come into common usage in the past couple of years, saying "be your best self," and I like that as a sort of encapsulation of how to reconcile qualitative individualism with a more virtue ethics kind of approach.
That was so wise.
Oh, thank you.
I appreciate that a lot, and I absolutely agree with you that this is one of the primary conundrums that we are faced with, right? And I think it's so much tied into our a lot of other cultural things, right? The relativism, I think, is a big piece of this. Well, I can believe this because who's to say otherwise? Whereas a virtue ethicist would say, well, I would. And I currently have a friend who is it is his life's mission to convince people that there are ethical truths, right? Mm-hmm. And that is something that we actually don't really have much of in this culture, but the melding of the two, being yourself and thinking critically about how to be your best self is I think a really neat solution.
Yeah. I think we do tend to think of there being ethical truths when it comes to politics. And I think the same kind of movements that have been around cultural appropriation and standpoint theory in the past 5 years. I think I've had a lot of problems with those movements, but something that I do find helpful and admirable about them is that they have moved well beyond relativism. Maybe beyond is not the right phrasing. They've moved away from relativism. That it is good to support marginalized people. Full stop. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter whether you think helping out the poor is not right for me, or it doesn't matter whether you think well, using the N-word is right for me. It's just wrong. And I'm not, I have a lot of problems with the content of the more universal ideal that they tend to put out, but I think it's helpful that at a certain level they are advocating a more universal ideal, and not just in ethics, but even in epistemology, that they're saying the marginalized group actually does understand things better than the privileged group. That there's a reality that is actually grasped better by one group than the other, and that's not subjective. The fact that the privileged group denies that does not make it so, does not make their denial so. And I think that kind of that brings a certain kind of universalism back into left-wing discourse, which I do think is healthy.
Good, thank you. That gives me some hope. That gives me some hope. I think that's really important, and I want to talk more about universalism and the left, and but we are running out of time, so
right.
Perhaps another time. This has been lovely. Do you have any final thoughts or things you'd like to share or ask before we go?
I guess maybe the one thing I want to sort of add as a note, that's kind of the big personal question for me right now, is the relationship between qualitative individualism and Buddhism. I am a Buddhist. I consider myself a committed Buddhist. I practice Buddhism daily in a couple ways. What is typically considered a core Buddhist doctrine is the idea that there is no self. And that's a very uncomfortable fit with qualitative individualism. Although ironically, the groups of Westerners who have historically been most interested in Buddhism have also been the qualitative individualists. I mean, Emerson didn't have a very sophisticated understanding of Buddhism, but he did like it, and so did Nietzsche. Nietzsche, to the extent Nietzsche liked anything, but Emerson and Nietzsche, they were certainly both interested in Buddhism and found it a helpful idea to think with and draw from. And certainly the 60s generation, again, the most qualitative individuals, and they were also the ones who went down to Tibet to study with the Dalai Lama and discover non-Western traditions. And I think it's kind of surprising to me in a way just how little that tension has been explored between the idea that you should be your true self and the idea that there is no true self, considering the sort of sociology of the interaction of the groups. The lack of attention paid to that philosophical question is kind of striking, and I certainly don't have an answer to it, in part because that groundwork hasn't been laid. But that's kind of what I'm working on right now, or one of the major projects that I'm working on, is to try and think through whether it's possible to have a view that is both qualitative individualist and Buddhist, especially around questions of the self.
That is something that I have also worried on quite a bit, and perhaps we can talk again about it in a few months. Oh, there's much I want to say, but I won't. I think this is a very important question for people who are sort of seeking, how to make sense of their existence, especially in our context. So we can leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I'd be happy to pick this up again sometime later.
Yes, and do keep up to date with Amod's blog, at which he will most likely be writing about these kinds of concepts. That is Love of All Wisdom.
Yep.
And I am Stefani Ripper. Y'all know where to find me. Thank you so much, and thank you, Amod.
Thank you for inviting me. This has been really good.
Cool. Thanks.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.